Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today we've got another video in our World War II Pacific Battles series. This time we're talking about the Battle of Cape St. George. First, here's a word from the museum. So, the Allies have been island hopping their way up the Solomon Islands, and along the way, they have just hemorrhaged cruisers. So, by this point in the action, they've decided, maybe we're not going to throw our tin-clad cruisers in to fighting here. We can just send destroyers in. Destroyers are expendable and easy to reproduce, and with their torpedoes, they can sink enemy capital ships, in theory, if they run into them. In practice, the Japanese have also hemorrhaged cruisers in the Solomon Islands and are mostly using destroyers these days too. The Japanese are still running the Tokyo Express, which is transporting cargo and troops using fast destroyers as opposed to slow transport ships. Because they've got to do it overnight. They've got to run in overnight, drop off their cargo, and get out overnight because the Allies have taken a series of airfields in the south of the Solomon Islands, starting with Henderson Field and Guadalcanal. And as the campaign moved north, the Allies either captured or built their own airfields as they went. The Japanese have an airfield at Buka, and they are worried that the Americans are going to attack there. In fact, the Americans have just invaded the island from the opposite end where the airfield is. And the Japanese think, well, that's kind of weird. It must be a feint. The real attack's going to be coming at Buka soon. So they dispatch 5 destroyers. 3 of these destroyers are loaded with troops. These destroyers are able to make it to Buka, offload their troops, and about 900, and on board about 700 naval aviation personnel who were with the airfield on Buka, which has basically been neutralized by Allied attacks at this point. And the destroyers are able to get out. And they're thinking, got to resupply this. This is where the invasion is. Well, here's the genius of the island hopping campaign. With Navy Seabees, construction battalions, you can build an airfield in the middle of the jungle. So you don't have to attack the heavily defended places where the Japanese have already built airfields. You can take another spot on the same island or the island next door, find some relatively level ground, blast the heck out of all the trees around there until it's flat, and then lay basically prefabbed treads to form a runway. Boom. You've got an airfield, and you've now got air coverage for the next couple hundred miles of your island hopping campaign. The Solomon Islands are where the Americans perfect this, and from here, now that we're leaving the Solomon Islands, they're just going to take it to the next level across the Central Pacific and into the Japanese home islands. So the Japanese still haven't caught on to this, hence they dispatch the destroyers with additional reinforcements. The Americans spot that the destroyers are on the move, and they dispatch 2 forces to catch them. One force is a group of PT boats, which is the backup. The other force is a squadron of destroyers led by Admiral Arleigh Burke, who's still a captain at this point. But 31-knot Burke is probably the premier destroyer commander, certainly in the U.S. Navy, arguably in the world at this point. And he is the guy who figured out the right levels of aggressiveness balanced with use of the new technology i.e. radar, and has started to add tactics to that in taking the fight to the Japanese now that he has been unsaddled from escorting cruisers and carriers. Burke has 2 destroyer divisions under his command, and his 2 destroyer divisions have 3 ships and 2 ships respectively. So he is commanding 5 ships, basically divided in half, much like the Japanese, who have 3 destroyers being used as transports and 2 other destroyers escorting them, so divided in half. Just after midnight on the 25th of November, the Japanese have dropped off their cargo and they're heading back north to safety. The American PT boats pick them up on radar, but assume, since it's 5 ships, that it's got to be Burke's squadron. They are wrong. The Japanese fire on them, and they might launch 1 torpedo in the interim and more or less withdraw without playing any part in the battle. Burke, however, is also patrolling these waters, and he picks up on his Sugar George set, Sugar George being the surface search radar. He picks up 2 of the Japanese destroyers. So he uses this tactic that he came up with that his friend, Captain Moosbrugger, has already used successfully in the last battle. And that is, you take one of your squadrons in for a torpedo attack while you cover them with the other squadron. So he leaves the 2 ships to cover and takes his 3 destroyers in to destroy the 2 Japanese destroyers that he sees. Because of the radar, he is able to see the Japanese and close to about 2.5 miles, about 5,000 yards. Beautiful, perfect torpedoing range. The Japanese aren't taking any evasive actions. They don't even know the Americans are there. They're still relying on visual identification. And while they have great night optics and great training, the American technology is finally at a point where it has the advantage. Burke launches his torpedoes and is able to score multiple hits on the flagship, which goes down with all hands. So there's the Japanese commander out of the picture immediately. Also scores at least 1 hit on the other Japanese destroyer. At this point, Burke is close enough that he sees the 3 Japanese transport destroyers, which were in a column behind the 2 escorting destroyers. And he takes off chasing after them. He's 31, not Burke, after all. There's a whole class of guided missile destroyers named after him. He takes off after them. The other 2 destroyers in his group, which were the covering force, now close in on that disabled Japanese destroyer and sink her. So already we've sunk 2 out of 5 Japanese destroyers. Burke is chasing these 3 Japanese destroyers and he's catching on them. Within about 40 minutes, he's run them down. These ships are heavily laden with troops, so they're not moving as fast as Burke. So they do the next best thing. They decide that they're going to divide into 3 portions. Burke is a good commander. He's not going to divide his own force any further than he already has. A 3-on-1 engagement is an easy win. 3 1-on-1 engagements, not so much. So they managed to score 1 hit on one of the Japanese destroyers that fails to explode, so she basically makes it away undamaged. Another Japanese destroyer makes it away undamaged. The one that he chooses to chase, however, he's able to run down and destroy with gunfire, and he sinks that vessel. At that point, it's about 4 in the morning, and he decides, hey, we're close to Buka Airfield. We probably don't want to be caught out here in the morning. We've burned up a lot of our fuel moving at high speed and a lot of our ammunition and torpedoes. So let's join back up with the rest of the squadron and head home. So they do that. The Japanese, like I previously said, don't actually have much functioning at Buka anymore. So they just, there is no counterattack on Burke, and he makes it out of there with all 5 of his ships utterly undamaged. This is a textbook engagement. This is how destroyers are supposed to fight. It is such a textbook engagement that there is a Ticonderoga-class cruiser commissioned in 1993 called the Cape St. George. There is not a Ticonderoga-class cruiser named after Savo Island or Iron Bottom Sound. Yeah, so this is one of those textbook engagements that is still taught to this day. And because of that, it's a relatively short video. The Americans fail in their objective. They aren't able to catch the Japanese fully laden on their way in. But that's not really a failure. They assume that the Japanese were going to be attacking their own anchorage or resupplying a base closer to them. Instead, all the Japanese were able to accomplish by completing their mission was leaving 900 more troops in an isolated position that would then not be resupplied for the rest of the war. So whether those guys are killed on destroyers that are sunk at sea or left to wither on the vine during the island hopping campaign doesn't really matter one way or the other. Burke gets his victory, goes on to receive a number of promotions and higher commands during his career. And of course, the capstone is the Arleigh Burke class of guided missile destroyers, the largest class of destroyers built since World War II, is named in his honor. This battle is about as close as you're ever going to get to a fair fight. 5 Japanese versus 5 American destroyers. And it comes out a resounding success for the Americans thanks to the tactics they're using, the new technology, i.e. the radar that they're using and putting their trust in, and the fact that they know the Japanese tactics. They know how the Tokyo Express works at this point. And that's just how the war is going to go from here on out. The U.S. Navy at this point is building up a large enough force that they won't have to fight fair fights like this anymore. The next battle that we're going to talk about is Operation Hailstone, and that's already been covered. We've got a whole playlist of other battles in the Pacific War. Be sure to check that out. At that point, I might have to do a time hop into the future and do the Battle of the Philippine Sea, or we could start covering some of the amphibious operations during World War II. But we're finally at the point where the Battleship New Jersey is going to participate. Let me know in the comments whether you'd like to hear about some of the amphibious operations or just stick with the pure naval battles. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, and also from a number of other sources, including viewers like you. Your support has allowed us to go from producing 1 video a week to producing 5 a week. And if you would like to continue to support us, there's a link in the description below for ways you can donate. Also remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you're notified when all that new content comes out. Thanks for watching.